let's get started. Today is the third of 3 workshops discussing DTSC's proposed toxicity criteria regulation. The first workshop was held by DTSC on December 12th. The second was held earlier this week, just this past Monday, at our Cal Center office. And today we're now having our third here in our Cypress office. Details on some of those prior workshops will be provided at the end of today's presentation. I want to remind everyone that today's workshop is very informal. However, we are recording today's dialogue, and that's so those that are unable to attend can hear on the department's link via our departmental link. Over the next 15 minutes or so, Kevin Deppies, our DTSC engineering geologist, and Kimberly Getman, our staff toxicologist, will give you an overview of the regulation. Then throughout the remaining time that we have this afternoon, we'll have an open discussion with you, taking and answering your questions regarding the toxicity criteria regulation. We'd like to ask that when you speak during the discussion, please state your name and affiliation. We have until 4 o'clock today. I'd also like to let you know, you will notice that there are 2 recording monitors at the table up front and the table to the left. And so I'd like to turn it over to Mohsen Nazemi.
There's also one more.
I'm sorry, one more monitor in the back. I'd like to turn it over to Mohsen with DTSC.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohsen Nazemi. I'm the Deputy Director for DTSC Site Mitigation Cleanup Program. Welcome to our workshop on toxicity criteria rule. And as you heard, this is our 3rd workshop that we were holding for this rule. The last one was actually earlier this week on Monday in Sacramento. And I apologize for starting this late. And the reason for that is that when we had our Sacramento workshop, the link that was provided on the notice wasn't working. And so we sent out a subsequent notice to everyone and said that if you wanted to be on the webcast but you couldn't, you will have another opportunity here in Cypress. And we didn't want to start this before that webcast was fully implemented, which has now, so we are good to go. This rule is being adopted by DTSC, and you'll hear all the details from staff later relative to our long-lasting practice of how we define toxicity criteria, which is used for screening levels, risk assessment, and setting up remedial action levels. We are planning to have a public hearing on September 20th in Sacramento, at which time there will be also a formal comment period for folks who want to come to the meeting. At this point, for today and Monday's comments, although we are here and listen to all your comments and take notes, we would ask you to follow it up in writing, because we are not entering these workshops into the record as official comments. But for the September 20th hearing, we will include those as official comments, and that follow-up in writing is always the best way to give us your comments, because we make sure we don't misunderstood or miswrote your comments when you made the comments. You heard all the introductions. Since we are starting late, I won't speak any longer, but I see a lot of DTSC staff here that are not part of the rulemaking process here, and I appreciate if you have any questions, we will have a separate meeting with DTSC internal staff. You can ask those questions later. This is an opportunity for members outside DTSC to ask questions and get responses. So with that, I'm going to first ask the folks that are sitting here at the table and our attorney to introduce themselves, and then we'll roll into the presentation. So let's start with Kevin.
So I'm Kevin Deppies. I'm a engineering geologist, work in the former Office of Military Facilities. Now I'm Legacy Landfills, and I work mostly on the Edwards Air Force Base project.
Hi, I'm Ray LeClaire, Torment Toxics, Division Chief for the Cleanup Program.
I'm Kimberly Getman. I'm a staff toxicologist here at DTSC.
I'm Vivian Marai. I'm a senior attorney at our headquarters office in Sacramento.
Thank you, and with that, without further delay, let's go ahead and start the presentations. Kevin, you want to start it off?
Okay.
Thank you again for coming.
Okay.
All right. So I get to talk about the rule, or at least the proposed rule at this point. It's to codify, the purpose of the rule is to codify and make clear the selection of toxicity criteria for use in human health risk assessments and selecting screening levels and remediation goals. It will be applicable to all hazardous substance release sites in California, including federal sites or federal lead sites, and those that will be handled under CERCLA and corrective action. The rule is necessary to make sure California's more protective standards are applied consistently statewide. Promulgation will ensure that the selection of toxicity criteria provide the level of protection that factors in California-specific considerations. It's important to remember that the rule codifies existing practice. We're not changing any way that the way we go about selecting toxicity criteria. In fact, we've had this essentially the same procedure in place or the same methodology in place for well over 2 decades. So now that I got that out of the way, let's talk about toxicity criteria, which is the most important aspect of the rule. To do that, Dr. Gatman will explain the key elements of the regulation. I'm sorry, of toxicity criteria.
Thanks, Kevin. So when do we use toxicity criteria? We use toxicity criteria in our baseline human health risk assessments. We also use the criteria when we do site-specific risk assessments. We use the toxicity criteria when we derive risk-based screening levels for soil, air, and water. And then we use toxicity criteria for deriving risk-based remediation goals when there's not a promulgated value already available, such as an MCO. We have 2 different types of toxicity criteria. We have toxicity criteria that address the non-cancer component of our risk assessment, and then criteria that address the cancer component of our risk assessment. And for both the non-cancer and cancer components of the risk assessments, we have toxicity criteria to address the oral exposure route and to address the inhalation route of exposure. So what are the sources of these toxicity criteria? At the state level, we have Cal EPA, and underneath the umbrella of Cal EPA, we have the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OWEHA, and DTSC. And OWEHA is responsible for developing the toxicity criteria that DTSC then uses at our sites, and we also oversee the use. On the federal level, we have US EPA, and under the umbrella of US EPA, there are many departments. Just 2 of those departments, one is the National Center for Environmental Assessment, and within NCEA is the Office of Research and Development, and another department is their Superfund program. And both ORD and Superfund develop toxicity criteria. The criteria that are developed through the Superfund program are developed upon request when a value is not available in the IRIS, the Integrated Risk Information System, which is the toxicity criteria that come out of ORD. Now, both ORD and OWEHA's toxicity criteria go through a substantial peer review process, including a public review process. DTSC's practice, as Kevin has stated, over the last 2 decades is to use the more health protective value when a value exists for the same chemical from both OWEHA and IRIS. So if OWEHA has a toxicity criteria for a chemical and IRIS does too, we'd use the more health protective value between those 2 programs. So why are we here? DTSC has been encountering challenges to how we select these toxicity criteria, and these challenges have been increasing. And this is in part to a 2003 OSWER, US EPA OSWER directive that talks about a hierarchy for selecting toxicity criteria at Superfund sites. And that hierarchy lists the US EPA IRIS values as a Tier 1 value, the US EPA provisional peer-reviewed toxicity values, or PPRTVs, as a Tier 3 value, and then other sources as a Tier 3 value. And those other sources listed in that document include OWEHA's toxicity criteria. However, that document for that hierarchy that's listed is not a mandate. It's not that you must use 1, 2, and 3. What that document is it provides guidance for selecting toxicity criteria, and it recommends that the best professional judgment is used when you select your toxicity criteria, that you use the best available science, and that a tier 1 value may not always be the best choice for your site. Thus giving you flexibility, giving the project team, the remedial project managers, giving them a choice and an option that they can use all of these when they select their toxicity criteria. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Kevin, who will get into the nuts and bolts of the regulation.
Yeah, so back to the rule. As Kim mentioned, DTSC is being increasingly challenged by some responsible parties on whether we should be using the federal IRIS value or the state OHIA value at federal lead Superfund sites. And so in part to address that, but also to ensure consistency across California and factor in California-specific considerations, we're promulgating this rule. It specifies that certain OHIA toxicity criteria to be used, which provide a higher level of protection than their corresponding federal IRIS values. And as mentioned before, these will be used in all human health risk assessments and for selecting screening levels and remediation goals at all hazardous substance release sites in California. So one of our goals is to make sure that the rule is an applicable or relevant and appropriate requirement so that it's applicable to federal lead Superfund sites. And the definition of an ARR is provided in the National Contingency Plan. It's above my pay grade to try and explain it to you. Essentially, there are legal standards that are required to be met in order to, that are required to be met when you develop your cleanup remedy selection at a Superfund site. So as we mentioned before, this is actually our third workshop and actually our second iteration of the draft rule. We listened to public input that was given to us on a previous iteration, and we actually made substantial changes where possible to the rule to address concerns that are being raised by the public. For instance, we removed the section discussing the setting of cleanup goals. It was just complicating the entire issue too much for us. And we modified the language for identifying the appropriate toxicity criteria for use in risk assessments. We also made some changes to clear up additional concerns by the public that the rule appeared to replace MCLs, maximum contaminant levels, and also that it mandated more stringent toxicity criteria than currently in use. And what we want to emphasize is the rule doesn't do either of these things. And with the changes we made, we made these changes to help clear that issue up. So that's what it doesn't do. Here's what it does. Similar to the OSWER directive, it establishes a hierarchy for selecting toxicity criteria. And the difference between ours and the federal is this hierarchy factors in California-specific considerations, of which I'll get into more detail in the next slide. It also defines the screening levels for non-cancer and cancer risk. And last, it specifies use at all hazardous substance release sites in California under DTSC jurisdiction. So now some details of the specifics of the rule. Section 69021, it parallels the OSWER directive, but it factors in California's unique conditions. The first step is to go to Appendix 1 in the rule, where we have listed selected OHIA toxicity criteria that we believe are protective of California residents and workers. And in deriving these values, OHIA takes into consideration California's diverse population, factoring in age and race sensitivities, and exposures based on cultural and income level differences. They're based on the best available science, and they're consistent with state environmental justice and child protection objectives. If a value is not available in Appendix 1, then use the EPA IRIS toxicity criteria. However, if a value is unavailable in either the Appendix 1 or in the IRIS, then other credible sources should be used, which are identified in the rule. For example, there's the US EPA remedial screening levels, or their PPRTVs, which we showed you what those were. I'm not going to try to say what they are. And another source are minimal risk levels, which are available in the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is also known as ATSDR, and other sources that we've listed in the rule. However, it's really important to note that the third tier criteria selection must be approved by the Chief of the Human and Ecological Risk Office with DTSC. Anyhow, so section 68, 400.5 and 69022 subpart A, they set the narrative standard, which is a legal requirement for the rule to be an ARAR. For clarity and consistency, section 69022 subpart B, that defines the cancer risk for hazard quotient, the cancer risk and hazard quotient for screening levels. And section 69022 subpart C, that ensures that the selection of toxicity criteria conforms with the existing regulations. So here we show how the rule works for the setting screening level for PC and indoor air. What it's showing is that without the rule, there's a potential for two sites side by side, one a federal lead and one a state lead, having significantly different screening levels. For the commercial industrial pathway, the state and federal levels are 2 and 47 micrograms per cubic meter, which is greater than an order of magnitude difference. Without this proposed regulation, having different screening levels at different sites would be extremely difficult to manage on from a state perspective, and it would result in some people being exposed to higher levels of risk. This is one example, but there is a host of compound contaminants that are impacted. Some of the most notable ones are vinyl chloride, benzene, and lead. So the next step. As we mentioned before, this is the second of 2 workshops for this version of the draft rule, where we're explaining and answering questions that you have on this, on it. And from there, we'll be going to the public hearing on September 20th. And that also actually coincides with the closure of our public comment period. After that, we'll be developing responses to comments and putting together, it's called the regulatory package for the Office of Administrative Law Review. And our goal is to adopt the final rule by the end of this year, or at the latest early next year. That's it for me, I think. Oh yeah, details are available at the website at the bottom of this page, this slide.
So yes, as Kevin mentioned, the public comment period, you can send in public comments through September 20th, 2017 at the indicators there. We'd like to open up the floor to public comments. Questions? Comments?
And sorry to take your, please state your name and try to talk. I'm purposely talking real loud to make sure the microphones pick us up so the webcast can pick it all up. I'm actually, maybe we should move it over here.
Yes.
More often we'll be answering the questions over here.
Yes, please state your name and affiliation, please.
Anita Rodney with Haley and Aldridge. So you indicated that these values are going to be promulgated and they'll be part of the regulation. How will they be periodically updated then? I
Yes.
assume?
They will.
Is there a frequency that it will happen? Will it be consistent with, for instance, EPA's RSLs or?
It'll happen so DTSC Hero will be responsible for keeping an eye out the traffic that's coming down, whether WEHA's producing a new toxicity criteria or IRIS. And when a new value comes out, we'll be updating at that time. We won't, if a value comes out, we're not gonna wait another 6 months to update the reg. So we will be updating it as soon as a new value comes out that needs to go into the regulation.
Thank you.
Hi, Janice Higgins. It sounds like the regulation is going to include that third tier being upon approval from DTSC staff. How does that play out for a local agency?
Well, and it's not actually staff, it'll be the chief of the Human and
Oh, I'm sorry,
Ecological
yes.
Risk Office. And
Yes.
that's really important that we have that centralized so that we to ensure consistency for what criteria can be used. But it's also, I think to answer your question, it's a site-specific decision that's always made. And Kim, you know better on how the tier 3 is actually applied.
Yeah, and I mean, we're not gonna, so any value that we are currently using from a tier 3 source will continue to be used. We're not gonna say those values aren't acceptable. And the way that HERO goes through it we're thinking of being able to implement it is that within the HERO, when we write a memo, all of our memos are peer reviewed. And they go peer reviewed up to our supervisor or the designee from the supervisor. And so the way that the regulation is written is that the chief of HERO would be approving those values for his or her designee. And so when tox criteria are in a regulation, we would be commenting on that in a memo, and then that memo would be peer reviewed up the chain as far as it needs to go.
So the peer review means that there are 3 separate sets of eyes from DTSC toxicologists reviewing it before it's approved for use at that site.
One thing though is, in reality, it's not much different than what we currently do. We're not going to be changing the values. We're just making the process a bit more formal.
And where it comes into play is if you have a site with a chemical where there are no toxicity criteria on, and so the site has been working on developing, the site team has been working on developing a toxicity criteria for that site. And to ensure that, that nobody goes rogue or some weird number doesn't get developed, that it just gets peer reviewed. Internal, it's not external. It will not be an external peer review, so it would not go out to the public for comment or anything. But it just guarantees some consistency within the department for using the same toxicity criteria.
So would you expect that a local agency would go through that process with DTSC to use a number that would be a tier 3 number? Or would we have access perhaps to the documents where you've already done this and we could follow sort of that example?
Yes,
What do you
and
think
for,
there?
so like, we will be updating, so you're aware of our human health notes. And so we would be updating those human health notes, and those screening levels are gonna be based off the toxicity criteria that we recommend. So there would be definitely means to be able to keep those. I mean, we'd be keeping our human health notes, note 3 updated to reflect the regulation. And so that's gonna reflect what the recommended toxicity criteria would be.
Okay, so note 3 would still be in play
Yes,
and be
definitely.
updated to,
Yes. To reflect
perfect,
this regulation.
okay.
Kim, can you explain what HERO is to everyone?
Sure, HERO is, we're the Human and Ecological Risk Office, and for DTSC, that is where all the toxicologists, risk assessors are located. And within HERO, we have our division chief, and then there are 4 supervisors, seniors, and then each senior supervises 3 to 4 staff.
I think you meant branch chief, not
Branch.
division chief.
Yeah, sorry, branch chief, yes.
Any additional questions, comments, suggestions?
I have a question. My name is Ruth Estes with Geosyntec Consultants. And I think you made the distinction, if I heard correctly, that this will be used for DTSC, under DTSC jurisdiction sites, under the Health and Safety Code. And I was wondering how this will relate to other sites that are being cleaned up under the Health and Safety Code. For example, the water boards, and how, if there will be any connection or collaboration.
Vivian, do you want to respond
That quite
to
well
that?
last time.
Yes, well, to the extent that Water Board is cleaning up a site under our chapter 6.8 or our state superfund code, this reg will apply. To the extent that the Water Board has a water code site, we'll be working with them to be consistent statewide so that health is protected on the same basis statewide and we have consistency.
Something we said.
We have been coordinating with Water Board and we will continue to do so.
But I think to clarify, the water board, has a different set of guiding regulations, protecting the resource, other issues that they have to balance as well. So they will come up with slightly different numbers than we do because, they have a different set of guiding regulations. Because, protecting the resource is a major part of their objective. So you're gonna see some differences, but it's gonna be site-specific and it's focused on resources and other things. But we do share tox values, so if we're both looking at humans, we would share those values. Where they're looking at protecting a groundwater basin, they're gonna look at slightly different kinds of things.
And the only reason that we did not make this applicable to water code sites is that we're not the water board and we don't have their rulemaking authority. So we couldn't just automatically do that. We'll see how it develops in our further coordination and maybe some other development will put us in sync better.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Florence Caribbean with the Del Amo Action Committee. And my first comment is, I'm very encouraged by DTSC doing this work to clarify the way cleanup standards are set. I think it's really important. And in the work that I've done, find that to be a point that really needs to be clarified. I'm particularly pleased with the language regarding how this would apply to a federal Superfund site, since we have 2 federal Superfund sites that we're working on. And it would be very helpful to have the state give their input on the cleanup levels and have a standard approach for doing that. I think it would really strengthen the work that's being done. And the other comment I have is that I worked at DTSC in the enforcement program for many years. We made decisions about the toxicity of chemicals that were found in our enforcement work. And I think it would really also strengthen the enforcement program if the people in that program had the ability to refer to this set of regulations and also to work with the toxicologists in determining the toxicity values for sites that they work on as well. I am going to submit written comments and I'll be supporting this rule. We have one particularly stubborn chemical at our Superfund sites, and it's really difficult to deal with because it's not a chemical found in very many places. It's primarily associated with manufacturing of DDT, and it's tough to deal with something like that because there aren't any studies, because there aren't any standards. And so that has to be kept in mind in the work that you do, that you can come across something like that. I also particularly appreciated the language that makes it clear that these chemicals can affect different people in different ways. And I think that is not something that is always in the discussion, and it should be. So I just primarily am expressing my support for these regulations, and I will be providing written comments.
One response to one item, if I heard you right, I think you were wanting to make sure that these tox criteria could be used under 6.5 for cleanup. This rule covers that.
Yes, and then the next thing is getting the enforcement people to kind of check in and know that that resource is available to them.
Okay, and that's part of why we set that first section out separately in case someone was looking for it in the corrective action regs. It's over there.
Okay.
Thank you. Any additional questions, comments, concerns? Well, thank you all for joining DTSC today. We enjoyed having you. Again, please keep in mind if you go home and you think of anything else you need to talk to DTSC about regarding this issue, again.
Bring it up then.
Call Kevin.
Yeah.
Follow in that handout, there's a link. All right, thank you.
Very much. Once again, thank you for joining us here in the Cypress office for this meeting and spending the afternoon with us. Sorry for the late start, but we gave you an early finish so that you don't have to stay here more than you need to. Again, it's really, really important for us to receive your comments in writing by September 20th. And for those of you who don't mind traveling or live in the northern part of the state, please join us on September 20th in Sacramento for the hearing for the rule. And there will be additional opportunities for comments at that meeting. So Thanks and have a nice day.